Okay, so it is now my absolute delight to welcome you to today's panel discussion, Radically Hopeful Futures, Cultivating Imaginations for Civic Engagement. Now, I know that this might seem like an unusual topic for an organization like Volunteer Alberta to dive into, but I assure you that it is actually foundational and fundamental to all of the work that we do within the social impact and voluntary sector. I'll offer a quote from writer Maria Popova to explain why. Quote, "In a world pocked by cynicism and pummeled by devastating news, to find joy for oneself and spark it in others, to find hope for oneself and spark it in others, is nothing less than a countercultural act of courage and resistance. This is not a matter of denying reality. It is a matter of discovering a parallel reality where joy and hope are equally valid ways of being. To live there is to live enchanted with the underlying wonder of reality, beneath the frightful stories we tell ourselves and are told about it." Unquote. Volunteer Alberta is starting to understand that in order for our sector to really fulfill the mandates and visions we have set for ourselves, we need to activate our imaginations of what those futures could truly be like. I am now so pleased to introduce our moderator for today's session, Darryl Dios, Volunteer Alberta's Research and Knowledge Mobilization Practice Lead, who will be our guide for our time together. Darryl, over to you.
Thank you, Mickey, for that thoughtful and wonderful introduction. And welcome everyone to our panel discussion for today. Before we begin, I actually want to extend one of my intentions for today, which is to try and cultivate dialogue with all of you. So for our panelists, I invite you to not only share your thoughts as I prompt our discussion, but to converse, respond, and build on each other's insights and ideas. And for our audience, you'll have some time to engage with our panelists more closely, but I also welcome you to share your thoughts on chat, to share your curiosities, how you might rephrase some of the language, or retell what comes up for you as you listen, or to extend any resources, readings, websites that you think are helpful in our conversation today. So we'll have about 40 minutes for our panelists to answer some questions and to dive into this topic together. And then we'll move everyone into smaller breakout rooms where each of our panelists will facilitate and lead discussions for 20 minutes to hear what all of you, our audience, has to say and to hopefully push the conversation further as well. Okay, so I want to start off by inviting our panelists to introduce yourselves with the intention of anchoring the space together. So say a bit about how you show up in the world or how you want to be seen. So I welcome you to share your pronouns and anything else about your positionality that you want us to know. And then after you introduce yourselves, say a bit about what excites you about our conversation today, what comes alive for you thinking about this topic. So I'll actually post the questions on chat so everybody can follow along as well. Okay, so introduce yourselves. And talk about what excites you. And for this round, let's actually start with Jacquelyn, and then Annand, and then Cassie. Also post the order on chat, and then just feel free to go when you're ready.
Lovely. Thanks so much. Sound check, 1, 2. Okay, brilliant. My name is Jacquelyn Cardinal. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm a Naheyawin social entrepreneur and technologist from the Sucker Creek Cree First Nation. However, I'm currently based in Edmonton, which is also known in the language of my people as a Pehonan and as a Miskuchiwaskiagan. I spend the majority of my time working as a founder and CEO of my company Naheyawin, where I work with my little brother to deliver training and cultural experiences to help organizations across Turtle Island unlock the power of Indigenous ways of knowing and being and their diversity and inclusion strategies. So we stay busy there. Other notes about things that I'm showing up with. I really appreciated the stretch break. I didn't realize I was getting my full Gollum hunch on. So thank you for that before we got started. And yeah, I mean, like I'm really excited about looking at the notion of imagination through my Indigenous lens and seeing what's reflected back by everybody here. For many reasons. One of the chief among them is really the fact that Indigenous knowledges, I find, are often seen as really centered on preservation and conservation, when my intuition about them is that they're actually primarily really generative and dynamic in nature. just like the land itself that those knowledges are based on. So for example, Sagiatuk is the first sacred teaching of my people, which is often translated as reminding us to love one another. So it's a good first sacred teaching to have. But interestingly, when you dig into the root of the word, which is Zagik, which actually means to grow, it kind of reveals a deeper meaning, which is really to remember the importance of growing with one another into an uncertain future. And to me, that speaks directly to the letting go and embracing of the unknown that imagination really asks us to do ultimately, and the valid role that each of us have in that growth forward. And I'm really excited that this isn't just like a fun thought exercise, as much as I love these kind of fun, abstract conversations, just like with an audience, but it's going to be a real discussion about how we actually apply these ideas to the pressing needs that we're experiencing today, broadly in our culture, and but primarily for civic engagement. So really excited to get into it. And thank you so much for having me.
Hi, everybody. My name is Annand Ollivierre. My pronouns are he, him. I am born and raised in Edmonton, Amiskwaciwâskahikan on Treaty 6. However, I am currently joining you from Athabasca, also in the town of Athabasca, also on Treaty 6, as part of my job and doing some work in with the community up here. And so, you know, I'm between locations and still able to join, which is great. What else can I say? I am I'm a child of immigrants. When my mother's from South Africa, my dad's from a tiny island of the Caribbean. And when I think about, you know, me and myself, I'm always between worlds. I'm somewhere, have a yearning to understand my mom's background in South Africa and the history of her ancestors who were brought to South Africa actually from South India. And so I'm always in a space of like trying to figure that out, trying to figure out what it means to be from the Caribbean, trying to figure out what it means to be born here, and I'm always in between. And I've had, you know, routine and ongoing discoveries of what it means to belong and where I belong and how I feel about my belonging. And so I think as it relates to this sort of imagination and the power of imagination and hopeful futures and curiosity, is that, you know, part of me navigating my belonging is to imagine how I want to belong and who I belong with and where I belong. And that I'm starting to learn that those are fluid notions for me, and that I get to create them as I want them to be, and then live into that imagined future and figure it out as I go along. I'm really excited to be here and happy to be joining all of you, and I'll hand it over to the next panelist.
Hi, everyone. Hopefully you can hear me okay. We're having a bit of a heat wave here in London in the UK, which is where I'm calling in from. And it does mean that the Wi-Fi keeps having issues. So I'm really hoping, that the infrastructure survives the call. As I said, I'm calling in from London, where I want to sort of do like a country acknowledgement of being surrounded by buildings and wealth that I know have come from the extraction and theft and harm of other peoples. And I think here we're just starting to work out how to acknowledge what we've benefited from by being here in the land of peoples that have always been the colonizers, or not always, but have done an enormous amount of harm. My background is in design, and I'm sort of in conversations as someone that thinks a lot about the practices of transition. And for me, that means spending some of my time thinking about how to support organizations to end well, and the kind of practices of hospicing and composting. And then the other part of that has been about how to, the role of midwifery and how to create the conditions for the new to emerge. And that's what's brought me into work around the collective imagination and imagination infrastructures. So it's really lovely to be here and to share some of the work I'm doing and hear and learn from all of you. So thank you for having me.
Amazing. Thank you, everyone, for sharing a little bit about yourselves and also for your thoughts leading us into our conversation. I'm actually now listening to all of you, extremely excited for the dynamic that you all bring together with your backgrounds and your experiences. And kind of going off of what Jackie was saying, I'm very much also looking forward to finding that balancing point between kind of discussing the abstract with the more practical aspects of this notion of curiosity and collective imagination brings us. So with that, I will start off with our first discussion question, which I've kind of prompted you folks to think about as a conversation starter. So how might you define imagination, and why should we be talking about it in relation to civic engagement and volunteerism? And I think for this one, I'll leave it open. So anyone who's prepared to speak can go ahead and do so.
I can take a first quick shot. So I promised my colleague Ria Castro, who is also an outgoing VA board member, that I would say this in this meeting because we just talked about it about 40 minutes ago. So today I'm defining imagination as I made some shit up. It's funny how often I actually think about that as being often something I say. It's something I often say in my work. I'm like, I just made some crap. Where did you come up with that? I just kind of made it up. But imagination then for me means if I try to, really look deeper than, a simple phrase, there's something about it where it's a combination of like a deep intuition, a sensing, and a relationship with the world outside of yourself, in which that gets kind of jumbled up inside of you, and I'll call it this intuition, this way of kind of perceiving in a different way, with a combination of some knowledge, and that knowledge can be gained through conversations. It can also be gained through things you read, things you watch, but things you invest some time in. And this idea of an intuition and a knowledge that you project now out into the future, and you try to see and try to configure how can these things, my intuition and what I've learned, be assembled in the future, and what can that look like, and how can I almost like time shift and imagine me or others or this world existing in that projected future that I'm creating. And so it's part of how I would say that I define imagination. I think one thing that I am conscious of is I often think, and we know this from a little bit of like brain science and things, that human beings often live in past-based futures. We take what we have experienced and we project it out forward. And often when we're thinking about how things could go or how they might go, we look behind us or in our past and we extract our information from there. Now that's often will really work. The people talk about the wealth of experience and being able to leverage your experience. I would say sometimes we are unconscious of what we are bringing through that past that maybe we'd want to leave there, that actually kind of attaches itself to the things we want to bring forward. And then all of a sudden they stop showing up. They start showing up in our present, and they start showing up in our future. So when I talk about imagination, of this combination of intuition and this sensing, this capacity that humans have with knowledge, I'm talking about thinking and receiving, for sort of like, maybe it sounds a little woo-woo, but how am I receiving information from what the future is wanting to have happen? How am I tapping into that and saying, how can I learn from and actually imagine what I'm sensing in the future is telling me to start thinking about today? So that's kind of my little, thing about how I define imagination. It's a combination of, I made some shit up with a deeper explanation about what that means.
I can jump in here. I already love the like the tensions that are starting to arise with like when we think about imagination, because that's my mind immediately when I was thinking, okay, like how do I define imagination? I do see it as actually kind of two different processes. And I liken it to like how I think about the difference between art and design. So like the type of imagination that is like design is geared towards solving a particular problem within like a set of like positive constraints usually, so like resources or time. And then there's another type of imagination, which is more like art, which is much more open-ended and curiosity driven, and not necessarily like at least on the surface for a given purpose. I think we're really good at the latter as kids, and then as we get older, we kind of lose that more kind of like artful imagination. And I think really both are useful and both have their place, but I think it's really, really important to know which one we're doing and intentionally and consciously switch between them as we need. And that's really important for in my work, because a lot of the work I do is kind of, trying to balance the indigenization that needs to happen of our institutions. How do we make them healthy, safe spaces for Indigenous youth, Indigenous communities, Indigenous people of all lived experiences to actually engage in, but then also this kind of ephemeral process of decolonization, which as everybody here, I'm assuming, is very colonized. It's very difficult to imagine not having that frame in place. So this is something that I try to imagine in kind of that artful way of imagination, thinking about decolonization, and in more of a design sense of imagination, thinking about indigenization. And so it's interesting to balance the two. But in the specific case of civic engagement and this topic here, I think it's really important that we use our imaginations to solve pressing problems that we can see and experience, but also, just as Annand, as you were saying, be conscious that there are many, many problems that we're sometimes not even aware that we have because of our frames of references as individuals and cultures. And this is something that my ancestors have suggested is possible to address through pretty similar means, which really is by coming together in circles to share our unique experiences and our imaginations as well, and also to listen to others too. And I was really delighted when I saw in Mickey's slide just before we got started here that word relationshiping, because that is such an important turning relationships into something that you do, turning it into a verb, is something that I think we can principally do through gathering in circles, either physically or even just as a mindset when we're engaging with others. So, and I think that really unlocks the ability to collectively imagine together in both senses of the design and the art. So that's what came to mind for me.
Yeah, and I think I spend quite a bit of time in my work trying to make the case for why resourcing this space for imagination is really important. It's not something many funders in the UK are like, yeah, like collective imagination, that's really tangible and we know exactly why we would resource it. Like there's always a case to try and make. And so I feel like I've had to like work out how to talk about it to that kind of audience. And I'm going to cheat by just reading something because I never remember it exactly, but it is something that I co-wrote with someone else called Olivia Oldham, where it almost is trying to say how like imagination or collective imagination is related to but distinct from maybe some of the other things that funders are more familiar with, like foresight or deliberative democracy processes. So it is related to but distinct from complementary ideas and approaches such as futures and foresight work, which focuses more on scanning the horizon of what is already coming rather than creating the conditions to imagine and construct new alternative futures, or narrative work, which shapes our understanding of the world but does not necessarily open the door to radically reimagining it, and deliberative democracy, which enables people to come together to collectively decide upon the future, but does not in and of itself require that future to be different from the present. And I think that especially that last bit is probably one of the reasons I think this work is really important for civil society and like civic futures, because I have a really sort of deep, quite visceral concern about how easy it is for us to just keep repatterning what we already have, what we already know, what's already familiar, or to respond to the very urgent and pressing needs of the present, of which of course we need to do, but it can't be the only thing we do. And for me, that's why making space for and resourcing and recognizing there are practices, and I think of it like a muscle, like making time for our imaginations and maybe, like I would say, rewilding them, which is also maybe similar to like decolonizing our imaginations. It feels really vital, actually, if we actually want to create and initiate and have intent around very different futures from where we are now, then I think like this idea of like resourcing our imaginations feels really important.
Awesome start. And I'm not sure if there's anything that people want to kind of build off of what you've already heard, but I actually want to riff off of some of the things that I've personally heard already before we get into our more formal discussion question. But I'm just curious if anyone can speak on, I guess, some of the problems that you may have seen in your, I guess, professional world, your professional lives, that you feel like you've required imagination. And it's really interesting how you kind of talked about how you approach why imagination is important, or specifically what it can look like. So some of the things that I've heard are around, needing to project yourself into the future, identifying this tension between kind of having a more organized, more design-focused approach to wanting to see what's ahead and trying to prepare for that, versus opening ourselves in a more kind of deliberative, democratic space of wanting to reimagine or imagine alternatives to, I guess, the present that we currently have. So again, I'm just curious, are there problems that you've seen that you want to talk about here, where you've had to use imagination specifically as we framed it here?
Darryl, was that to the panelists or to the whole group? Sorry.
Yeah, the panelists.
Okay. I feel like I should go first because I've not done that. So I'll go first, even though I don't know what I'm going to say. I mean, I guess I identify as queer, and I actually feel like so much of the kind of structures of like status, hierarchy, a lot of the things around, just like as I was growing up, there was so many things that didn't make sense to me, because they were, like all these, like getting married, or so much around heteronormativity. And so I think I was always thinking, well, this can't possibly be the only way that like the world is, or that I have to live by. So I think just generally, I've always found ways of living outside of the status quo, because the status quo isn't where I have any resonance. But I guess on a much more sort of practical, tangible level, actually working, I previously worked in a really big bureaucratic institution that was linked to the government, and I would say most days I was having to use, or the team that I was in together, we were having to use our collective imagination to work out multiple ways to be like Trojan mice around the different processes and approaches that were never going to serve us in trying to do the kind of work we needed to do. So I think that's the thing for me, this work around imagination, we can sometimes think it's like outside of us and it's far away, or it's this new thing, and actually sometimes it's in the everyday acts in which we always see the potential to do something differently. Like there is all that, not always, but I'm someone that generally tends to think there is nearly always another way around things. There is always more possibility. So that's probably, those are two quite different things. Yeah.
I love it. I'm just going to jump in quickly to just say, like, yes, queer all the things. I love it. That's totally like how I like to approach as well. And like, I love that you, Cassie, shared like a kind of a personal story, because that's where my brain went as well. So just like super bridged for me. It's very similar in structure, I think. But like I was recently diagnosed with ADHD, which has been a really interesting process of learning. But it's in kind of pursuing different kind of like methods of kind of working through it and understand it. I've discovered just like how much this notion of like laziness has been constructed in order to enable people to participate in economic activities. And kind of previous to that, people weren't labeled as kind of like lazy, and how this is something that is very new. And so it's almost like you kind of stumble upon these kind of sites in your brain that you didn't realize were so caged into how we tend to think about things. And for me, it really has changed how I think about the world, because then it's just like, okay, if I've kind of fallen prey to, I think, what many of us do of conceptualizing my own like self-actualization and purpose in life, as connected to work and my ability to be productive. And that's fundamentally, flawed, or at least outside the realm of how I actually want to identify my life. Now that I have this information, it kind of frees me to think of, in a scary way sometimes, how then do I derive purpose and meaning? And how can I make sure that I also hold space for others to do the same? And that's something that is really important to me now. And and that's something that I try to do in like other kind of like sites of life that I've also tried to queer myself. And it's definitely a fascinating learning process that feels intensely personal. And I think that's what's so special about it. So.
Totally. Those are, yeah, those worlds and those responses, and I basically want to like yes and everything that has just been said, Cassie and Jacquelyn, and so yeah, for me, like definitely the first thing that came to mind when this sort of question was asked was, more on me as a person, my existence. I it's funny that really the first thing that came to mind is, I have wonderful parents, and my parents, when I encountered things in school, bullying, racism, and things like that, my parents always reinforced that I deserve to exist and be there, and that I matter. And so I had like, that's part of my imagination, is to always create a world in which I matter, even when a world around me may say that I don't, or that I don't quite belong. And I think, Jackie, what you just said about laziness resonates very strongly with me. Like the labels, if you go and look at my report cards, they'll be like, has a lot of potential, but is easily distracted. That's like every single comment. And I think what was missing in that, and those observations from those teachers, if I was to say who I was in those moments, was someone who was deeply seeking and wanting to engage in relationships. And through that, that's how I, would get anything done. And funnily enough, that's basically like what my job is now, is to do things with others and get things done. But imagining a world in which I matter is a big part of how I use my imagination, I think, often. And then in that practical way, it's like, it's funny. For those who don't know, I used to work for Volunteer Alberta for a number of years. And part of what we did when I was there is imagine what we could do together. Like, what can we do? What are the programs we want to create? What is something we can do differently? What are the conversations we want to be having with community? Imagining how we could, in the ways that made sense, in the ways that we thought we resonated with our members and with our stakeholders, can we imagine how we can work and do good work together? And that was a big part of my everyday, and is still a big part of my everyday in my work now. So yeah, those are kind of like the two kind of examples of like that, where it's applied all the time.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I want to second what Katie says here. Thank you for being vulnerable and sharing kind of those personal stories. And I think a lot of that is, for me, like anchored by what Annand said, which is you want to help create or imagine a world where you feel like you matter. And I feel like for me, that's definitely something that's extremely resonant. Similarly, being a child of an immigrant or being a first generation immigrant myself, like there were times, and this has, taken a lot of reflection on my end of realizing when I feel like, where I felt like I don't necessarily fit in. I've had to kind of transition or shift my mindset of maybe saying not that it's not necessarily me, but it's more with the way that the world is kind of constructed. There are ways that it's hard for me to fit in, or it's hard for me to access the normal kind of structures that that other folks might be able to. And I also like how you also segue kind of into the bigger structural aspect of wanting to do similar things with, from VA's perspective, with our members. What are the different ways that we might want to imagine alternatives? So again, maybe go back to that core aspect of how can we create worlds or structures where we feel like we all matter in those distinct ways. And I think that actually segues us into our discussion question of, so in the realm of in the realm of imagination, what might it mean for us to be good organizational ancestors? So framed alternatively, what might it look like for us to set the groundwork for realizing our imaginations for the future in the here and now? I think maybe this time I will start off with Jackie. Or no, Annand. Let's start with that instead.
Oh man. Okay. So this is definitely something that I've been thinking about a lot lately. The organization I work for, J5, it has existed in Calgary for about 10 years. And this year we've opened up an Edmonton office. A few of us are part of that Edmonton office. And we've been asked to reflect on some stories in this year that we could share with the world. And so I've been thinking about this story, and I'm very grateful for where I am at J5 and having this opportunity to work with the team and folks that I work with. And I had this thought one morning where I was like, how did we get here? How did we get to where we are? There were people who started this organization and company 10 years ago. They've gone through trials and tribulations, successes and failures. They've kept moving forward. They've kept wanting to work on the next thing and figure out what the next thing that could be. How do they continually reinforce and create a valuable and meaningful organizational culture? And there have been people who have come and gone within this organization over those years. And many of them I don't know who they are, and some I do. But all of those collective efforts and all of the efforts that they put out into the work and the clients that they've had and all those sort of things, all of that collective effort allowed for an opportunity for me to join the organization and allowed for us to have a place to work out of in Edmonton. And then I just kind of had this moment where I was like, well, what am I doing? What am I doing to create and embed and weave into the existence of this little group in Edmonton? What am I doing to ensure that people 10 years from now, those that I may never know and those that I may never encounter, that they benefit from what I've benefited from? And so for me, that's how I think of, like, I'm imagining what it could be to be. I'm imagining how I'm part of this organizational ancestry. I am someone else's ancestor. I have not met them yet, and I don't know who they are, but I am today. So what am I going to do today to ensure that how the contributions that I make show up in their world as something that is of value and meaningful to them? And how is it that allows them to show up within their community, within the world, in ways that are valuable and meaningful to those around them? How am I thinking about that and how I work with the clients and folks? And so I'm really trying to extend my existence far out on a plane of existence so that I can make choices today that are reflective of who I imagine myself wanting to be and who I imagine this organization wanting to be, because somebody did that for me. And so, that's kind of it. I'm very much sitting in this question and discovering it as I go along. And I think one thing that I've landed on is, for me, it's important to be a caregiver and host for folks that are around me, and for my colleagues, and for the clients, and how am I hosting and caring for what they care about. And I think that's where I'm landing right now, and I'm contributing to that. That's part of the ancestor I hope to be known as.
I'm going to jump in here because that's exactly how I was thinking about it. And then the only thing that I think I would add is the, of course, it's so important. We have several teachings from my people and others just about like 7 generations about like, how can you kind of consider what you're doing and how it impacts, 7 generations in the future. And you can shrink it back to make it a little more tangible. But I've really loved that. And it's also helped me be like, okay, like, let me pause and think about not just even the first order effects, but the second order effects as well of whatever it is that I might be doing. But I'd also love to balance that with something that I've been thinking a lot about, which is this, maybe paradoxically seeming notion that we have to imagine ways to begin practicing the values and norms and all the structures of the ideal future, like right now, in order to be ready for that ideal future that we're trying to create. So that way, our organizational descendants are actually like ready to step into that future when it comes. Because it's one thing to kind of construct that ideal world, and it's another to actually be able to operate in it. I sometimes when I think about, these amazing worlds that I want to, help build, I think about actually living in them, and I'm just like, oh, I gotta get ready. I gotta do some, philosophical jumping jacks to make sure that I'm ready for that time when it comes. And so I think that that's also important, just in that notion of caretaking and hosting, is that we also have a responsibility to kind of make sure that we are practicing as along the journey. And that's something that's been really important for me. And then it also helps make it so that you're not just waiting for, just 100% delayed gratification when you're doing this work, but you're also seeing that, like, we can start to even realize some of that beautiful future right away, which I think is also really kind to not only ourselves, but so that our, descendants aren't just like, oh my gosh, people have been working to make this happen for me and everybody else that I'm working with. And I don't know if we're ready. Like, we hope we don't break it. So it helps, I think, kind of also bring down the kind of stress levels that at least I would have if I was kind of adopting or kind of receiving that kind of amazing work. So, but I love the kind of far future notion with thinking about organizational ancestry. It's an awesome question.
And I love that what you were just saying, Jackie, about the what we can do in the today that is like practicing what we're imagining or hoping for in the future. Because I think like one of the things that I think is really important is about, like, I think it was Adrienne Marie Brown who said, what you pay attention to grows. And so some of the work in the present that I think the kind of imagination practice can really help with, it's that shift in perception and that noticing. It's like some of that future is already here, and how are we nourishing it and paying attention to it so that it grows. Or Bill Sharp, who is the person that designed the 3 Horizons framework, which I use a lot in my work, he talks about the patterning of hope, which I also think is that idea of paying attention to the patterns in the present, or getting a sense of where you hope the future will be, and noticing back to the present about how that will, like, how that's already being manifested. But it also makes me think about, I guess for me, the practices. I think of infrastructure or infrastructuring as a verb, and I feel like infrastructuring is for me something about what you're seeding and growing and leaving behind. And so talking about imagination infrastructures, that we have been thinking about that as not only trying to, in the same way, you might invest in hard infrastructure like roads or railways, like how do you do that long-term investment in this idea of collective imagination? And that's about creating the spaces, resourcing the spaces, growing the practices, deepening the practices, and actually archiving as well. Like we've been working with an archivist to think about how do you kind of the material cultures of like collective imagination practice, and how does that get archived and exist over time. And yeah, so that I think that's kind of the idea of imagination infrastructure for me, is something about like this longer term and this sense of what you're leaving, like what does it mean to be good ancestors. And then maybe the last thing I'll just say is about I also think that's why the work of hospicing and making good compost is also part of being a good ancestor. So you know, thinking about organizations continually connecting to like their relevance today, and that like, should they still exist? Is their purpose still resonant? Are they still the right organization to be playing that role? And I feel like that is a really important part of this work as well. It's like making space for the new, or divesting in the old, which I think clears space for imagination to grow.
So next question for me then, again, I think this segues really well into this, is, so in your opinion, what might be holding us back from engaging in imagination? What do you feel like we need to learn or unlearn? I lost track of who should be going first, so I'll leave this open.
I'm happy to jump in again. Get it over with. I mean, just a few things. So I guess from a UK perspective, some of what's holding us back is, you know, terrible government. You know, there's just so many things that are, I think a lot of the UK public and the sort of in the UK public consciousness is a sense of like, this is it, you know, like there's a fatalism and there's a real sense of there's no way beyond this. So I think, you know, lots of people living in survival mode, people either in survival mode or total denial, you know, and I think that is really like blocking people's imagination and people's sense of like what else might be possible. I also think, you know, in the UK and in the West, we're so disconnected from us as nature, and you know, we are part of the living world, and we're so numb to that, we're so disconnected from that, that I think that has really stunted our capacity to imagine. I also think that we're so individualistic, so I'm particularly interested in collective imagination actually, and not this individualized thing of like, what do I imagine? I'm really interested in like what can the collective imagine that an individual never can. And then lastly, I guess, you know, we really need this work to be coming from different imaginations. So whose imagination and who gets to imagine? Yeah, that's so important. And there's a lot of like clearing the way in somewhere like the UK context for the kind of imaginations we really need to be living within. Yeah, that's kind of I think another thing that's getting in the way in this context.
I can jump in, and Cassie, you actually stole a lot of what came to mind originally for me too. So that's excellent. No, and I mean, I think the only thing that maybe I'd love to kind of zoom in on a little bit more is the I think many of us fundamentally believe that there's not enough to go around, just broadly, like in every sense. And I mean, I don't think that's an accident. Like our institutions have been using that scarcity as our social glue for like many generations. So it's not like our fault. It's not, you know, just like a new kind of trend or something. But that scarcity will never enable a free imagination of what could be. It'll always limit us to imagine, you know, at best kind of incremental improvements. And the word, I think it was Tolkien, he made it up for Lord of the Rings, but it was this idea of eucatastrophe. So it's this idea of like a turn of events where everything suddenly goes right. So like what happens at the end of Lord of the Rings, spoiler alert, I guess. And this is what I think we don't ever really allow ourselves to ask. And I think it's really revealing of, you know, like what if everything suddenly went right? And how can we enable that? And I think that really shows that kind of underlying, like the fear. I think a lot of us also, we don't look on our ancestors all the time with a whole lot of grace and understanding. And I think that sometimes makes us fearful of trying new things. Because then we're fearful of, you know, our descendants having the same kind of lens on us, which is inevitable. We all, we all, do the best with the information we have sometimes, which is really flawed, and there are evil people in the world, blah, blah, blah. But yeah, I think that kind of kindness that can come from, about ourselves and our ability to try new things and say things that we have in our minds and in our hearts, especially in a collective sense. I think that when we have that kind of care and understanding for those that came before us, then we can also have that for ourselves. So I think there's also a generational element there. And yeah, just the fear of failure, I think, is the thread through those ideas as well. I think people are really afraid of messing things up. So that's what comes to mind for me.
Yeah, nothing much more to add. I given all the different challenging contexts and worlds around us, I think one of the things that resonates with me around why is it, what's holding us back is this collapsing of imagination, optimism, and being naive. And that like, it's almost like I've experienced this myself, and I'm sure others have, that you offer a new idea or something that you think could happen, and people may come back to you and be like, well, that's not realistic. And you're just naive about what's going on. And it's kind of like, yeah, that's the point. I'm trying to be a little bit leaning more towards hope. And I'm trying to be unrealistic in this, not in the sort of like, not factoring in the realities of how things have to happen, or what can, resources and other things and time and attention and all the things that are needed for things to happen, but that I'm trying to be unrealistic. Like I'm trying to take something out of, I'm trying to remove the idea from the constraints that have been put on it. And it's that kind of critique and criticism that I think often holds people back. So, my prompt or my challenge that I offer to myself often, especially when like my kids say something even as simple as like, can we go get ice cream tonight? I'm like, well, I don't know. But it's like, I kind of shut down their idea because it's this and it's that and it's all these other things. But also when it comes to the work world and other professional or volunteer worlds, to really say to myself, how can I be curious about what this person is offering is that I may see as unrealistic, and really kind of just be like, what can I understand more about that? Because I think we all have a tendency at times and we live in a world that tells us that many things are unrealistic. They're pie in the sky. They're naive. You're not a realist. And there is a time to be a realist. There's a time to look at risk, but there's also a time to imagine and to be unrealistic. And for us to temper our willingness to throw back at people that they don't know what they're talking about, or they're naive.
So we're actually going to now be moving into our breakout room phase, but thank you for really setting the context for us and for this discussion so far. I'm going to bring you all back to share your final thoughts from this discussion, but also potentially what you hear from your breakouts. But so yeah, as I mentioned, we'll now divide you, everyone here, into 3 breakout rooms, each led by one of our panelists. We'll also have a VA staff person taking notes in the background there. And as part of our commitment to you, we will be sharing a what we've heard report back to all who've registered here. But essentially, what we can expect in that discussion space is to be able to engage with our panelists more closely. They'll also be posing questions to you folks to to frame the conversation, and I'll post those here. But where does imagination show up in your professional lives? And then when it comes to volunteerism and civic engagement, what do you personally imagine? So again, the purpose of this is to invite you all into this conversation that we've started here. And I don't know if Nikki, you have other thoughts. I see you've shared your screen.
I think the only thing that I will add is just for some additional context about why we're having this conversation. As I mentioned during the AGM, we are entering a new strategic phase for Volunteer Alberta, and our staff and board are going to be engaging in strategic dreaming in the fall. But in order to do so, we need to hear from all of you, from the communities and people who we serve. And so this is one of the inputs that we are going to be using to help us do that work. So yeah, please share with us please share your thoughts with us. We'd love to hear it.
And I think Cindy will be breaking everybody into rooms. Pretty sure I'm not forgetting anything, but let me know if I am from the technical side of things. But you should be getting your prompts for joining rooms. Okay, I'm seeing. Looks like everyone's back. I hope everyone had a good conversation in their breakout rooms. Just to close things out here, we're gonna come back to how we started and throw it back to our panelists. I'm just really curious if any of you have concluding remarks, things that came up for you in our general discussion, or also even in your breakout rooms. Just very brief concluding thoughts. Maybe let's finish up how we started. So let's go with Jacquelyn, Annand, and then Cassie.
No, absolutely. I just want to say first, like how much I really enjoyed the breakout conversation. It was really interesting to hear how folks are conceptualizing as imagination, volunteerism, civic engagement as really wanting to be moved into a place of identity and a place of strength and pride in how people navigate kind of their, and just like how we approach kind of deepening those relationships. So that was really interesting. And just broadly, like I'm delighted to have this topic of imagination come up in this specific space. I think it's timely, and I think just broadly, is a bigger, piece of the puzzle societally of how imagination can really help us. So yeah, I enjoyed it. I really got a lot out of this conversation. I feel like I have a reading list. Thank you, Cassie. And I love this. Thank you again so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity and the space to have this conversation with all of you. It's given me a lot to think about. I think, in our breakout room, some of the things that I don't know if it was specifically said, but for me, one of the takeaways, the things that I am thinking about is sort of the tension that seems to be, but maybe I don't take certain that isn't real, but the tension between obviously like what it takes to engage your community and engage volunteers on a day-to-day basis, and the demands that are happening around services and the demands of people's time, and the perception and the kind of space that may be required in order to imagine a different way of doing things, and this tension that exists. And I say is it a real tension? Because I think I'm thinking about, there's something about how we can navigate this tension by imagining it not as a tension, but as like a curiosity, and something to be explored. But again, I also recognize, but that it takes space to even consider that question. And so I think in our panel conversation, or our breakout room, we were just kind of moving through that space of that tension and what it means. And I'm also taking a lot away from this conversation. I think I will be curious and wondering and wanting to figure out this piece around composting for a while now, because I really do see in my work the difficulty that sometimes happens in when I'm going to, like I said it in our breakout, when the rotting fruit is still sitting around and hasn't been appropriately composted and turned into the fertile ground of the future, and that it actually like impacts people, and we bring it up all the time, and like, well, it's, you know, this thing and this thing and this thing. It's like, okay, but you know, is that holding us back? Can that be composted and over time turn it into fertile soil? I'm really, yeah, that's a big takeaway for me. So thank you for that, Cassie.
Thank you, and I will share. We have a meetup around hospicing and composting, and the practices of that, which there's actually quite a few Canadians that come. So I'll share that in the chat. But yeah, thank you for having me. Some of this work is really hard to do and make the case for, as I said earlier. So it's really lovely to be in a space where there's an open-mindedness and a curiosity. And yeah, that's been really lovely. And in terms of the group, it was just really nice to hear from everybody, and a few things that I took away from that, or that feel maybe important for like the next part of your journey together and the work you're doing is, firstly, Ria, I hope I pronounced your name right, said like imagination is healing. And I think that's a really powerful statement, and also shouldn't be underestimated in terms of when we tried to resource, we gave 51 different place-based communities some money to imagine where they wanted to go and how they wanted to shape their futures, and really underestimated how hard that was for some of those communities, because actually they needed some time first to just process and heal and grieve, and that's work's not done still, but there's a whole set of things you need to do, I think, to even enter into that space of imagination sometimes, and to recognize that. And that links to, yeah, I think as you go into this strategic dreaming process, we touched a little bit on what are the conditions you need to create in this network or community to, you know, what somatic practices, what other ways of knowing and being, and kind of like, how do you really prepare for that work so that you feel confident you won't just repattern things. And then lastly, I think a really important other part of the work that I've found is language, which came up a little bit in our group. And language is such an important way to signal and orient and kind of inspire different imagination. And certainly in the civil society sector in the UK, language gets flattened quite a lot because we think we want to be so careful about accessibility and inclusion, but actually sometimes in doing so we really do, yeah, I think we can strip away the potential for new possibilities that language can contain. So yeah, sorry, that was a bit long, but thank you so much for having me, and I've really loved to speak with the other panelists as well, and connect with you all.
No apologies needed. I just want to take some time to extend my appreciation for each of you. I feel like there's so much to learn from all of you individually, but I feel so happy to have just been part of this conversation that you've carried for us, with all the insights, the challenges, the realities and tensions that you've all brought up for us. As Mickey mentioned earlier as well, a lot of what we've brought up here will inform our strategic planning, our strategic dreaming, and kind of the future that we hope to imagine for Volunteer Alberta. There are a lot of great things that I feel like will serve as guidance points that you've helped lead us through. So again, thank you so much for that. And I think I'm just gonna give it away to Mickey for some concluding remarks if she have any.
Yeah. Well, I'll start with my deep appreciation. I am sitting with the richness and the nuance of everything that was brought into the room today. And so all of you have my deepest appreciation and thanks for being in conversation with us today. And the conversation is going to continue. So for AVCN, the Alberta Volunteer Center Network, we have regular meetups. Our next one is on June 19th. And so folks who are part of that crew, check your inbox for invitations. And we are going to be having another conversation that will help inform our strategic dreaming. And then for our larger community, stay tuned for a couple of invitations later this summer to join us for those conversations too. So check your emails, it's all coming. And so maybe what I'll do, thinking about somatic practice, Cassie, as you've invited us to do, as a way of signing off for today, and maybe what we can do is just take a moment, close your eyes, get comfortable in your seat, however you are, and just breathe in slowly and breathe out. And breathe in and breathe out. And as you breathe in, pay attention and notice what you are appreciative for in today's conversation. And as you breathe out, consider what you are taking with you into the world. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. So lovely to connect with you all, and I look forward to continue conversations. Thanks, friends.